He was sure he was in control until he saw his ex-wife's name in the will. It seemed like a joke to him until the lawyer voiced the truth that turned his world upside down. Subscribe to not miss new videos and write in the comments what city you're from. Richard Hale exuded confidence as he strode through the towering glass doors of his corporate headquarters. The morning sun reflected off the polished floors of the lobby, casting long, commanding shadows. Employees greeted him with stiff smiles and murmured, "Good morning, Mr. Hale," as he passed, but he barely acknowledged them. Power was a currency, and Richard had learned long ago that the best way to maintain it was to act as if it was his birthright. At 53, Richard was at the pinnacle of his career. CEO of Hale Enterprises, a business empire spanning multiple industries, real estate, technology, and finance. His reputation was one of ruthless efficiency, a man who could turn any venture into a gold mine. But what few people knew was that Richard Hale's success was built not only on business acumen, but on careful manipulation, strategic alliances, and an unwavering belief in his own superiority. To the world, he presented himself as a forward-thinking leader, a man who embraced diversity and progress. His speeches at business conferences often highlighted the importance of equal opportunities and corporate responsibility. He funded scholarships for underprivileged students, attended events that promoted workplace inclusivity, and shook hands with people he privately considered beneath him. But behind closed doors, his true nature was far less palatable. Richard despised weakness, and in his eyes, weakness often took the form of those who were different from him. People of color, particularly black individuals, whom he saw as inferior. He would never say it aloud, of course. He wasn't a fool. The world had changed, and open racism was unacceptable, especially for a man in his position. But he knew how to wield power in ways that ensured those he deemed unworthy remained in the background. Promotions at Hale Enterprises were given strategically. Diversity was a necessity for optics, but real influence stayed with those he trusted. Black executives, when hired, were carefully placed in positions with little actual authority. Partnerships with black-owned businesses were announced with great fanfare, but kept minimal in practice. For years, Richard had navigated this delicate balance masterfully, until one miscalculation changed everything: his marriage to Amara Johnson. Amara had been a rising star in the business world when he met her. A brilliant strategist with a keen eye for investments, she had built her own consultancy firm from the ground up. She was eloquent, poised, and commanded respect in every room she entered. When Richard first encountered her at a networking event years ago, he had seen an opportunity. A black woman with influence and connections, respected by some of the most powerful investors in the country. If he married her, it would cement his image as a progressive leader. More than that, it would give him access to her network, a world he had yet to fully conquer. And so, Richard had courted Amara with precision. Flowers, extravagant gifts, carefully constructed moments designed to make her believe in the fairy tale. He played the role of the devoted partner, charming her with words about partnership and shared visions of the future. It worked. Within a year, they were married. For a time, the arrangement was perfect. With Amara by his side, he was welcomed into elite circles that had previously been wary of him. Investors who valued social consciousness saw him as a man who embraced change. Business deals came easier. His public persona became untouchable. Then, as soon as he no longer needed her, he discarded her. Their divorce had been swift and brutal, Richard ensured that Amara walked away with as little as possible, using every legal trick at his disposal. He had no intention of letting her keep any advantage over him. By the time the papers were signed, she had lost much of the financial stability she had built. He had assumed that would be the end of it. But fate had other plans. 2 days ago, Richard had received the news that George Pearson, one of the most powerful investors in the country, and his greatest ally, had died. Pearson had been more than just a financial backer. He had been a mentor, a gatekeeper to the highest levels of wealth and influence. With Pearson gone, Richard expected his empire to expand even further. He was confident that Pearson had left him a significant portion of his fortune. After all, Richard had been his most trusted partner for years. It was a given that he would be named in the will. He had already begun making plans, imagining the increased control he would wield. The competition would be eliminated. His name would be cemented as the heir to one of the greatest business dynasties in the country. The meeting at Pearson and Adler law firm was merely a formality. Arriving at the firm's downtown office, Richard was in high spirits. The waiting area was filled with people, other business figures, family members, associates of Pearson's empire. Richard barely glanced at them. He was only interested in what was coming to him. Then, as he scanned the list of beneficiaries, he saw the name that made him freeze: Amara Johnson. At first, he laughed aloud, drawing the attention of those around him. "This must be a mistake," he smirked, turning to one of the lawyers. "Amara Johnson? My ex-wife? Pearson barely knew her. What, did you get some token amount for charity work or something?" The lawyer, a tall man with silver hair, adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Hale, I would advise you to take a seat." Richard's smirk faltered. When the room was called to order and the lawyer began reading the will, Richard leaned back, waiting for his moment. Pearson's estate was vast, consisting of real estate holdings, investment portfolios, and, most importantly, his controlling shares in Hale Enterprises. Richard was ready for the inevitable moment when his name would be read as the successor. But instead, the lawyer's voice echoed through the room with words that turned his world upside down. "To Amara Johnson, I leave the controlling majority of Hale Enterprises, my financial holdings, and all associated assets, granting her full executive authority over the business and its future direction." Silence. Richard blinked. It had to be a joke, a sick, twisted joke. Then the weight of the words hit him. Pearson had given everything to her, his ex-wife, a black woman, a woman he had used and discarded. And now she owned him. Richard shot to his feet, his pulse hammering in his ears. "This is some kind of mistake. Pearson would never—" The lawyer held up a hand. The will was updated 3 months before his passing. It was thoroughly reviewed and legally binding. "There is no mistake, Mr. Hale." The room buzzed with murmurs. Some people looked at Richard with barely concealed amusement, others with pity. But Amara was unreadable. She sat across the room, composed, watching him. She wasn't surprised. She had known. She had known all along. Richard felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Powerless. For the first time in his life, he was no longer in control. And Amara Johnson, his ex-wife, the woman he had underestimated, was now his boss. The limousine ride back to Hale Enterprises was silent. Richard sat stiffly in the back seat, gripping his phone so tightly his knuckles whitened. The city blurred past the tinted windows, a landscape he once ruled now turning foreign and hostile. His thoughts spiraled. Rage, disbelief, humiliation, each one clawing at his sanity. He had spent his life building this empire. Every move calculated, every deal masterfully executed. And now, overnight, it was gone. Not to a competitor, not to a more powerful investor, but to her, Amara. The woman he had discarded like an obsolete investment now held everything. His mind replayed the moment in the law firm over and over, the way the lawyer's voice had sealed his fate. To Amara Johnson, I leave the controlling majority of Hale Enterprises, granting her full executive authority. Richard couldn't accept it. There had to be a mistake, a loophole, something he could exploit. His phone buzzed, a message from Brent Holloway, his personal attorney. "Call me ASAP. We need to discuss your options." Richard exhaled sharply, tapping the screen. "Tell me this can be overturned." Brent sighed on the other end. "I've gone through the documents, Richard. Pearson's will is airtight. Legally, Amara has full control. The shares, the assets, the board votes. It's all hers. There's always a way to fight this." Brent hesitated. "You could try contesting it in court, but it would be an uphill battle. Pearson was of sound mind when he made these changes. Any challenge would take years, and in the meantime, Amara would still be in control." Years? Richard didn't have years. Every day that Amara remained in power was another day his legacy slipped further from his grasp. "This is bullshit." His voice was ice. "Pearson would never—" "He knew, Richard," Brent interrupted. "About you, about how you used Amara. Pearson found out everything before he changed the will. The divorce, the manipulation. He saw you for who you are. That's why he chose her." Richard's breath left him in a slow, venomous exhale. So that was it. Pearson hadn't just cut him out, he had punished him. The billionaire's last act wasn't about passing down a legacy. It was about revenge. The limo pulled up to the towering Hale Enterprises headquarters, its glass windows reflecting the storm raging inside Richard's head. The driver opened the door, but Richard didn't move. For the first time in his career, he hesitated before walking into his own company. Because now, it wasn't his. And that was the most unbearable truth of all. The office felt different. As Richard walked through the main lobby, he saw stares, hushed whispers. Employees glanced at him, their expressions a mix of curiosity, amusement, and barely concealed schadenfreude. They knew. Of course they knew. The legal transfer had been instantaneous. Amara now owned the majority shares, giving her absolute authority. And, while Richard still held a stake in the company, his power had been gutted. Worse than that, he wasn't even fired. He was demoted. The email from the new executive office was waiting for him the moment he sat down at his desk. Effective immediately, Amara Johnson will assume full leadership as CEO. Richard Hale will remain within the company in an advisory capacity. His new role will be determined after further evaluation. An advisory capacity? They had neutered him. Richard slammed his laptop shut, blood roaring in his ears. A knock on his office door. He knew before he looked up who it was. Amara stepped inside, her stride confident, composed. She wore a tailored navy suit, sharp and deliberate, the kind of power dressing he used to wear. "Richard." She greeted him coolly, like a queen addressing a dethroned ruler. "You set this up," he hissed. Her expression remained neutral. "I did nothing except accept what was given to me. This company is mine. You think you can just—" "It was Pearson's." Amara cut him off, her voice sharp. "And now it's mine. That's how ownership works." Richard clenched his jaw so hard it hurt. "The board won't stand for this." He leaned forward, voice low and seething. "You're an outsider. You don't belong here. You don't know how things work in this world." Her lips curled. "Your world?" The weight of her meaning hit him like a freight train. Yes, His world, the world of boardroom games played by men like him, wealthy, white, untouchable. A world where women like Amara were never supposed to sit at the head of the table. And yet, here she was. He forced himself to smirk. Let's see how long you last. Amara didn't rise to the bait. Oh, I intend to last, Richard. But you? She glanced at his still unassigned position. You're in limbo now. I could fire you outright, but that would be too easy. He narrowed his eyes. What the hell does that mean? A small, calculated smile. I think you should stay. You built this empire, after all. You should watch what happens to it. When I take it in a direction you never imagined. A chill slid down Richard's spine. Amara wasn't planning on just taking the company. She was planning on changing it. And that was the worst threat of all. The next few weeks were pure humiliation. Richard was still in the company, but he was powerless. The once feared CEO now sat through meetings he didn't lead. Employees who once scrambled to appease him now barely acknowledged him. Worst of all, Amara didn't oust him immediately. Instead, she did something worse. She restructured the leadership team. The new COO, a black woman Richard had overlooked for years. The new head of finance, a black man Richard had pushed aside for a lesser qualified friend. Amara was undoing everything he had built, and he had to sit there and watch it happen. Richard tried to fight back. He met with board members, tried to turn them against her, but Pearson's backing had been too strong. They wanted stability, and under Amara, the stock was rising. Everywhere he turned, he hit a wall, and the whispers began. Hale is done. She's running the show now. You see his face in that meeting? Priceless. Richard felt rage boiling inside him, but it didn't matter, because the world had already moved on without him. But if they thought he would go down without a fight, they were wrong. Richard had built his empire with ruthlessness, and if Amara thought she had beaten him, she hadn't seen what he was truly capable of yet. Richard sat alone in his dimly lit penthouse, the glass of whiskey in his hand untouched. The city sprawled before him, a jungle of skyscrapers and neon lights, but for the first time in his life, he felt like a stranger in it. He had ruled this city. His name had commanded respect in every boardroom. Now, he was a spectator in his own empire. He had spent weeks suffocating under Amara's reign, watching her reshape the company, replace his allies with her own, and strip him of everything he had built. But Richard Hale wasn't finished, not by a long shot. The humiliation had started immediately after Amara took control. Richard wasn't fired, which would have been a mercy. Instead, she forced him to stay, demoting him to a powerless advisory role, an empty title, a cruel joke. His new office was not on the top floor, where he had ruled for decades. Instead, he was relocated 2 floors down, next to mid-level management, in a smaller office with a standard desk instead of the mahogany throne he had once commanded. And worse, his new direct superior was a black executive he had once dismissed as lacking leadership qualities. The entire company saw it as poetic justice. He saw it as war. Richard knew he needed leverage. He spent the next few weeks analyzing everything Amara was doing, every deal, every hire, every financial decision. She had made it clear. She wasn't just taking over Hale Enterprises, she was transforming it. Sustainable investments, ethical business practices, diversity initiatives. It was suicide in the corporate world, or at least that's what Richard told himself. But despite his expectations, the stock wasn't collapsing. The board, which he had assumed would revolt, was cooperating. Investors were intrigued, not panicked. The numbers, to his absolute disgust, were actually improving. But Richard had built this company on a foundation of loyalty through fear, and he knew something Amara didn't. Not everyone was happy with the new regime. His first target was Stephen Langley, the company's longtime CFO. Langley was old-school corporate, conservative, profit-driven, resistant to change. He had been one of Richard's closest allies for years, but now he was isolated, surrounded by Amara's appointees. Richard cornered him after a board meeting, speaking in low, urgent tones. "This woman is destroying the company." Langley hesitated, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "You've seen the numbers," he muttered. "It's not collapsing, Richard." "Not yet," Richard pressed, "but we both know how this ends. These changes she's making, pushing sustainability, equity, policies, these things eat away at profits over time. If we let her continue, this company won't survive 5 years." Langley exhaled slowly. "Even if I agreed, what can we do? She owns the controlling shares." Richard's smirk returned. "For now." Langley frowned. "Richard, there's always a way, Stephen. We just need to find it." It took 2 more weeks before Richard had his opening. Amara had started reevaluating major partnerships, including a $1 billion deal with a Hong Kong-based logistics firm, one that had been highly profitable under Richard's leadership but had a questionable legal record. She wanted out. Richard saw opportunity. If he could manufacture a scandal, make it look like Amara had mismanaged finances or breached contracts, he could shake investor confidence and force a leadership crisis. And so, he set the plan in motion. He needed someone to take the fall. A mid-level financial officer, a scapegoat, who could be framed for altering reports under Amara's leadership. Richard found his pawn in Elliot Graves, a nervous but ambitious financial analyst who had recently been promoted under Amara's restructuring. Richard arranged a private meeting with Elliot under the guise of an internal review. "Elliot," he began smoothly, pouring them both a drink, "you're a smart man. You understand how the industry works." Elliot shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Hale, Richard," he corrected, offering a warm smile. "We're just talking." Elliot hesitated but nodded. Richard leaned forward. "Tell me, have you noticed anything off in the recent financial reports?" Elliot hesitated. "I mean, there have been some new reporting methods, but nothing illegal. Amara is new to this world." Richard sighed, shaking his head. "She has good intentions, but good intentions don't always make for good business. If she's making miscalculations, unintentionally, of course, it could hurt all of us." Elliot swallowed. I don't know." Richard slid a folder across the table. Inside were altered documents, forged financial inconsistencies that didn't really exist. "The board is worried," Richard lied. "We need someone to double-check these numbers, maybe even make a report, just to make sure Amara's decisions aren't hurting the company." Elliot looked at the papers, his doubt wavering. Richard saw the moment he won. "Look into it," he said, patting Elliot's shoulder, "and keep it between us." The trap was set. Elliot would discover the fabricated inconsistencies and report them internally. Richard and Langley would escalate the findings to the board, painting Amara as financially incompetent. If the stock took a hit, investors would panic. And, with enough pressure, the board would force Amara to step down. Richard would regain control. It was perfect. Until everything went wrong. 3 days later, Richard arrived at work to find security waiting for him. Langley was already in the executive conference room, looking pale. Elliot Graves was there too, So was Amara. She sat at the head of the table, a manila folder open in front of her, her expression unreadable. Richard felt the shift immediately. Something was wrong. Amara looked up, locking eyes with him. "Sit down, Richard." The calm in her voice chilled him to the bone. Richard slowly sat. "What's this about?" Amara held up his forged documents. "These financial discrepancies," she said, tapping the papers. "We had them independently audited. And guess what?" A pause. "They're fake." A deathly silence fell over the room. Langley visibly swallowed. Elliot looked ready to vomit. Richard kept his expression neutral, but his mind was racing. "Now," Amara continued, folding her hands, "imagine my surprise when I traced the source of these fabricated reports." She slid another document across the table. A security report, detailed logs of who accessed financial records, when, and from which terminal. Richard's name was all over it. He felt a rare flicker of fear. Amara leaned back. "Did you really think I wouldn't see this coming?" Security stepped forward. "Richard Hale," one of them said. "You're terminated, effective immediately." Richard stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You can't." Amara rose too, taller than him now, stronger than him now. "Oh, I can." For the first time in his life, Richard Hale was powerless, and Amara Johnson was the one who destroyed him. The fall from power was swift and brutal. Richard had built his empire with ruthlessness, and now it had been torn away with equal ferocity. His name was stripped from the company's masthead. His office cleared out before he had even left the building. Security had escorted him out like a common criminal, his employees watching in stunned silence as the once feared titan of industry was marched through the marble lobby in disgrace. No words were spoken. No whispered sympathies. Some looked away. Others smirked. They had all been waiting for this moment. And Amara? She had watched from her office window, calm and composed, her expression unreadable. Richard hated her for it. His lawyers tried. They fought tooth and nail to contest his removal, to challenge the legal standing of Amara's takeover. But Pearson's will was unshakable. The financial fraud attempt, his fraud attempt, had only sealed his fate. The board had turned on him instantly, eager to distance themselves from scandal. He had no allies left. And the investors, they didn't care. Hale Enterprises was thriving under Amara's leadership. Stocks rose. The media loved her story, a woman reclaiming her place in the corporate world after being exploited and discarded, now standing victorious over the man who had once tried to erase her. She wasn't just winning. She was erasing his legacy, brick by brick. And worst of all, there was nothing Richard could do. For weeks, he spiraled. The penthouse that had once been his sanctuary became a prison. His phones rang with calls he ignored, lawyers, former allies, journalists sniffing for an exclusive. The city that had once belonged to him now felt hostile, its skyline mocking him with Amara's victory. His mind raced with rage, shame, and resentment. But underneath it all, a deeper fear began to take hold. Who was he without Hale Enterprises? Without power? Without control? What did he have left? He had built his career on dominance, but now he was nobody. The final blow came in the form of a board announcement. Under Amara's leadership, Hale Enterprises was rebranding. A new name, a new future. Hale Enterprises would be renamed Pearson and Johnson Global Holdings. His name, his legacy, was being erased from history. And when Richard saw the press conference, saw Amara standing at the podium announcing the transformation with grace and strength, something inside him snapped. He couldn't let this stand. Richard had one final card to play. If Amara thought she could just erase him, she was dead wrong. She had taken everything from him: his company, his name, his power. But Richard knew things, secrets that could destroy her reputation. He just needed to find the right weapon. And he knew exactly where to look. The meeting took place in a private club late at night, away from prying eyes. Across the table sat Stephen Langley, the former CFO who had been ousted in Amara's restructuring. Langley's face was lined with bitterness, the resentment in his eyes mirroring Richard's own. "She ruined me," Langley muttered, swirling his drink. 20 years in that company, and she threw me out like garbage. Richard smirked. "Welcome to the club." Langley narrowed his eyes. "Why are we here, Richard? We both know you're finished. You don't have leverage anymore." Richard leaned forward. "Maybe not, but I still have information." Langley scoffed. "You want revenge? Good luck. Amara's practically untouchable now." Richard grinned. "That's what everyone thinks." Then he pulled out a file, a thick folder filled with documents, some dating back years. Langley's smirk faltered. "What is this?" "Everything," Richard said smoothly. "Every questionable deal Amara was ever involved in. Every legally gray decision she made before she became CEO. And trust me, Langley, she's not as clean as she pretends to be." Langley flipped through the pages, his expression shifting from skepticism to intrigue. This, he hesitated, this could hurt her. Richard's smirk widened. Exactly. Amara had taken everything from him. Now it was his turn. The first rumors surfaced 2 days later. Whispers of mismanaged funds, of past deals that weren't quite illegal, but questionable enough to raise eyebrows. Then the anonymous tips started flooding news outlets, leaked documents, allegations of financial inconsistencies during Amara's time as an independent consultant. Richard watched it unfold with satisfaction. The media turned on her quickly, sensationalizing every minor misstep, painting her as a hypocrite. And the investors? They didn't like uncertainty. Amara's once solid support began to crack. She went from victor to defendant, forced to hold press conferences denying the allegations. The tide was shifting. Richard could feel it. But then, something happened that he hadn't planned for. Amara didn't break. She fought back. Instead of crumbling under the weight of the scandal, she stood firm, methodically dismantling each accusation. She produced records, had former colleagues vouch for her, exposed the holes in the so-called leaks. And then, in a move that caught everyone off guard, she turned the investigation on Richard himself. If the media wanted to dig into past dealings, she would make sure they dug deep. Within a week, the narrative flipped. New stories emerged about Richard's tenure as CEO, the real unethical deals. The times he had bent the law. Deals that had long been buried, until now. The final blow came in the form of a federal investigation. The SEC opened an official review of Hale Enterprises' past transactions. Subpoenas were issued, and Richard Hale was at the center of it all. The media descended like vultures, every network broadcasting his downfall in real time. He had tried to destroy Amara. Instead, he had destroyed himself. 2 months later, Richard sat in a courtroom, his empire gone, his name shattered, facing charges of corporate fraud. The judge read the charges in a monotone voice, but Richard barely heard them. His mind was stuck on one image. Amara, sitting in the front row of the courtroom, watching. Not gloating, not triumphant, just watching. Because she didn't need to destroy him. He had done it to himself. And as the judge's voice rang through the courtroom, sealing his final fate, Richard finally understood. This wasn't just revenge. It was justice. and he had never stood a chance. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos. Check out the next one or explore more on the channel. And if you like this video, share it with others.